This video is brought to you by Ground News. In recent weeks, various stories have emerged related to campaign finance here in the UK. We've seen reports that Reform UK could be a beneficiary of $100 million from Elon Musk. And there's been news that former Conservative mega-donor Nick Candy has joined Reform, with the aim of raising as much money for the party in advance of the next general election. This has raised questions about campaign finance rules here in the UK, with some wondering whether this would be considered foreign interference. So in this video, we're going to have a look into campaign finance rules in the UK, how they work, and whether there's a valid argument that they should be changed. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, it's worth starting this video by bringing that $100 million figure back up, because it's a good way to illustrate the situation we're currently in with campaign finance in the UK. Across the pond in the United States, the amount spent on elections dwarfs that of the UK. In the 2024 election, the Democrats and the Republicans spent about $3.5 billion between them, making it the most expensive presidential election in history. The figure for the UK election this year unfortunately aren't available, but to give you an idea of how much is typically spent, across all parties £41.6 million was spent in the 2017 general election. This means that parties in the UK in 2017 spent about 89 pence per eligible voter, or when adjusted for inflation and converted to US currency, about $1.47. This year, US parties spent around $5.42 per eligible voter on the election. So, in total, the US spends just over 3.5 times the amount as the UK per voter. The point is that while the suggestion that Musk might provide Farage's Reform UK $100 million sounds like a lot in the UK context, it's peanuts in the context of elections over the pond in the US. So, why does the UK spend so much less on the election? Well, essentially, unlike the US, the UK has strict limits on how much can be spent on campaigning material for candidates. Now, the rules can often overlap and are relatively confusing, so we'll start with limits for parties and then have a look at limits for individuals. When an election's called, it creates a so-called regulated period that spans the previous 12 months. In the case of snap elections, this means that parties often don't know exactly when this regulated period is going to be, so have to be careful what they spend if they expect an election is coming soon. In this so-called regulated period, parties can spend only £54,010 for each constituency they contest, or just over £34 million in total if they contest all seats. It's worth mentioning here that this figure has actually increased by 80% recently, to reflect the impact of inflation since the rule was introduced in 2000. Prior to this change, parties could only spend £19 million in total if they stood in all seats. Now, there's one major exception here. A party can spend either £54,010 multiplied by the number of seats they stand in, or £1,458,440, whichever is higher. In essence, this means that parties standing in a small number of seats are able to disregard the £54,010 limit per constituency and just spend about £1.4 million instead. We do need to caveat this with the fact that these are the limits in England and that different rules apply in the rest of the UK. Anyway, these are the limits in the regulated period for parties. However, individuals also have spending limits, and these limits kick in at two different points: the long campaign and the short campaign. The long campaign kicks in 55 months after Parliament sits for the first time, so roughly 4.5 years. Now, in essence, each candidate has a fixed £40,220 limit, plus 8p per voter in an urban seat and 12p in rural seats. So, for urban constituencies, this means that a candidate's maximum theoretical limit is £46,000. In rural constituencies, the average is £49,000. Just to make things a tad more confusing, this limit is divided between the remaining months of the Parliament. If, for example, the election takes place a full 60 months after Parliament first sat, then the full limit here applies. If not, then the limit is proportional to how far into the long campaign the election takes place. Essentially, the nearer to 55 months it is, the closer to zero the actual limit is. The nearer to 60 months it is, the closer to the maximum theoretical limit the actual limit is. And just for the hell of it, to make matters even more complicated, the long campaign limits don't apply at all if the election takes place less than 55 months after Parliament first sat. This was the case in 2017, 2019, and this year's election. Once the election itself is actually called, though, we get into a period called the short campaign. Here, there are a whole new set of rules for candidates, with a fixed £11,390 limit being applied to all candidates, and the same pence multiplier as the long campaign applying for urban and rural seats. The average spending limit in an urban seat is £17,000 and £20,500 in a rural seat. So, these are the main rules when it comes to campaign finance. So let's move on and go through some of the criticisms. Now, one of the main criticisms being made at the minute is that Musk, a foreign national, shouldn't be allowed to donate such a massive sum of money to a UK-based party. The thing is, he can't. There are also limits on exactly who is able to donate to parties, and he doesn't meet the criteria. Rather, one of the much more important criticisms is the undisclosed nature of donations from unincorporated associations. Provided these organisations donate less than £25,000 to political parties, they can do so without questions being asked about how they got this money in the first place. These organisations are intended for small non-profit groups, but have been misused in recent years, with Politico reporting that they've donated more than £14 million to political parties between 2018 and 2023. Another criticism of the rules is the way in which parties spend money campaigning online. While traditional campaign material is closely regulated, this isn't true of online content. In recent years, parties have been accused of spreading false information online in campaign periods, with good examples being the Tories doctoring interview footage, the Liberal Democrats' use of dodgy bar charts, and Labour photoshopping their opponents. Currently, this falls outside the purview of existing oversight, and is simply left to social media platforms to regulate. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't been progress made already in this area. An update to the rules in 2022 means that parties are now required to leave some kind of imprint on online campaigns, for example. But clearly, like in the offline world, in the online world, there's still a lot more work still to be done. Now, this isn't the only financial issue that the UK faces at the moment, though, with the UK economy actually contracting by 0.1% in October, despite the government's real focus on growth. This has been covered extensively by more than 92 news outlets. 22% of the reporting is coming from the left, and 44% is coming from the right. If you compare the headlines, you'll start to see some interesting framing emerge, with right-wing outlets hammering the Chancellor for this issue, and even claiming that it might be evidence of a recession. This is all possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organise them by story, and every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. One of my favourite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean left, you might have missed this story about North Korean special forces accidentally killing 8 Russian troops in Ukraine. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers each story you see online. And best of all, we're currently offering viewers 50% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features like their blind spot feed. This is their biggest discount of the year, so go to ground.news/TLDR, click the QR code here on screen, or use the link in the description to subscribe today.